Were the 80s secretly trying to traumatize children? Or did parents simply have no idea what they were putting into the VCR? These movies weren't just weird, they were filled with melting flesh, screaming mutations, nightmare puppets, and scenes so disturbing they stayed burned into young minds for decades. And somehow, kids watched them anyway. Tonight, we're reopening 11 sci-fi movies that crossed the line between entertainment and psychological damage. And one of them still makes grown adults uncomfortable to revisit. Critters, 1986. They looked like evil plush toys until they opened their mouths. Critters had one of the most dangerous childhood traps of the 80s. It looked silly enough for kids to watch, but nasty enough to leave them checking under the bed afterward. These little alien creatures were not elegant monsters or mysterious space invaders. They were hairy, rolling balls of teeth, appetite, and bad attitude, turning a small-town farm into a late-night feeding ground. What made them so disturbing was the contrast. One second, the movie felt like a mischievous creature feature. The next, these tiny things were biting, chewing, screaming, and attacking with a viciousness that felt weirdly personal. For kids who discovered it on VHS or television, Critters was the kind of movie that made toys, pets, and dark corners suddenly feel suspicious. The practical effects gave the creatures weight and texture. They looked dirty, spiky, and hungry, not polished or safe. It was funny, yes, but the humor never fully softened the threat. That is why Critters stuck in people's memories. It turned something small and almost cute into a nightmare with teeth. And honestly, that may be the most unfair kind of childhood trauma. Killer Clowns from Outer Space, 1988. A circus was supposed to be colorful, not a candy-coated death trap from another planet. Killer Clowns from Outer Space took one of childhood's strangest fears and pushed it into full sci-fi madness. The villains were not normal clowns. They were alien predators wearing carnival faces, turning bright colors, goofy props, and circus music into something deeply unsettling. Cotton candy became a cocoon, popcorn became a threat, balloon animals became weapons. The genius of the movie is that it never chooses between ridiculous and disturbing. It laughs at itself, but the visuals still crawl under your skin. Those oversized clown faces, rubbery smiles, strange bodies, and frozen expressions made the whole film feel like a nightmare from a child's birthday party gone wrong. For younger viewers, that was the trap. It looked playful from a distance, but the details were grotesque. The movie understood that childhood imagery can become terrifying when twisted just slightly out of shape. That is why it became a cult classic instead of a disposable joke. It weaponized innocence. And once you saw those clowns harvesting people like snacks, the circus never felt completely safe again. Life Force, 1985. This was not the kind of space movie parents expected when they saw astronauts and alien discovery. Life Force begins with a grand cosmic mystery, but quickly turns into one of the strangest and most uncomfortable sci-fi horror spectacles of the 80s. Instead of clean spaceships and heroic adventure, the film delivers space vampires, drained bodies, collapsing flesh, infected crowds, and a city slowly losing its mind. What made it so traumatizing for younger viewers was the feeling that the danger was not just attacking people, it was consuming them from the inside. The victims often looked emptied, aged, or physically ruined, as if life itself had been sucked out of them. That visual idea was deeply disturbing, especially in a decade when many kids stumbled across adult movies without warning. Life Force also had a bizarre atmosphere that made it feel unpredictable. It moved from outer space to laboratories to apocalyptic London with dreamlike intensity, never letting the viewer feel stable. The result was messy, bold, and unforgettable. Even when the story became outrageous, the imagery had a sick fascination. It was cosmic horror with a fever dream pulse. For kids expecting space adventure, Life Force felt like accidentally opening a door to something adults should have locked. The Dark Crystal, 1982. This was supposed to be a fantasy adventure, but it looked like a nightmare carved out of bone, dust, and dying royalty. The Dark Crystal terrified children because it did not feel bright, soft, or protective. Its world felt ancient, sick, and strangely alive, filled with creatures that looked too detailed to ignore and too unsettling to love. The Skeksis were the real childhood damage. Their hunched bodies, cracked voices, Rotting faces, twitching hands, and greedy eating habits made them feel less like villains and more like something decaying in front of you. They were not just evil, they were physically unpleasant. Even the heroic side of the film had a strange, fragile sadness, as if the entire universe was exhausted. For young viewers expecting wonder, the Dark Crystal delivered wonder mixed with discomfort. Every puppet had texture, wrinkles, breath, and weight, which made the fantasy feel dangerously real. That is why the movie stayed with people. It did not simply scare children with monsters. It introduced them to a world where beauty and ugliness lived side by side. The result was unforgettable, but also deeply uneasy. The Dark Crystal proved that puppets could be more disturbing than any masked killer. The Never-Ending Story, 1984. Few childhood movies hurt this badly while pretending to be magical. The Never-Ending Story is often remembered as a fantasy classic, but for many viewers, it carried emotional damage that felt almost unfair. The most famous wound is the Swamps of Sadness, where Artax slowly sinks while Atreyu desperately tries to save him. It was not loud, fast, or visually extreme in the usual horror sense. It was worse because it felt helpless. Children watching it were forced to sit with grief, panic, and loss before they even fully understood those emotions. But the film also had plenty of disturbing imagery around that moment. The giant wolf-like Gmork, the collapsing world of Fantasia, the sense that imagination itself was dying. That made the movie feel bigger than a simple adventure. It was about darkness creeping into something innocent. For kids, the trauma came from betrayal. The title promised wonder, flying creatures, and escape, yet the film delivered sadness with shocking force. That is why it remains so powerful decades later. The never-ending story did not ruin childhood through gore. It did something more personal. It made children feel loss in a way they could never forget. Return to Oz, 1985. Someone looked at one of the most beloved children's worlds ever made and decided to turn it into a haunted institution nightmare. Return to Oz shocked young viewers because it did not feel like a cozy trip back to a magical land. It felt cold, strange, and quietly threatening from the beginning. Dorothy is placed in a grim setting before Oz even appears, and once she returns, the colorful fantasy has become ruined, empty, and almost post-apocalyptic. The Wheelers alone were enough to disturb a generation, with their stretched limbs, screeching voices, and unnatural movement across the ground. Then came Princess Mombi, whose collection of interchangeable heads turned fairy tale royalty into something closer to body horror. The film's visuals were not just scary, they felt wrong in a way children could not easily explain. Familiar Oz had been stripped of comfort and replaced with corridors, stone figures, broken companions, and villains that felt too grotesque for a family film. That is what made it unforgettable. Return to Oz weaponized nostalgia before many viewers even knew what nostalgia was. It took a safe childhood place and showed it damaged, twisted, and unsafe. For some kids, that was more frightening than any monster. Extro, 1982. Some movies feel like they were made from nightmares nobody wanted to explain afterward. Extro is one of those strange 80s sci-fi horrors that did not simply scare children. It confused them, disturbed them, and left them wondering what they had just seen. The story begins with alien abduction, but it quickly becomes something far uglier and more uncomfortable than a simple visitor from space tale. Its most infamous imagery involves a grotesque alien return, a shocking birth-like sequence, and a household slowly poisoned by forces that feel unnatural and impossible to understand. What made Extro so damaging for young viewers was its dream logic. It did not always explain itself clearly, which made the disturbing moments feel even more invasive. Toys, family spaces, bedrooms, and ordinary domestic life suddenly became unsafe. That is a powerful childhood fear. The idea that horror can enter your home and rewrite the rules while adults fail to protect you. The effects may look rough today, but that almost makes them worse. They have a dirty, handmade quality that feels wrong in the exact way old VHS nightmares often did. Extro was not polished comfort horror. It was weird, grim, and deeply unsettling. And for anyone who saw it too young, it became less like a movie and more like a memory they wished had stayed buried. Videodrome, 1983. This was the movie that made television itself feel infected. Videodrome did not traumatize kids with aliens chasing people through hallways or spaceships exploding in the sky. It did something stranger and more psychological. It suggested that the screen in your living room could reach back, reshape your body, and poison your mind. David Cronenberg built a sci-fi nightmare around media obsession, signal manipulation, and physical mutation, turning technology into something warm, fleshy, and deeply wrong. For younger viewers who accidentally stumbled into it, the imagery was impossible to process safely. A television seemed to breathe. A human body opened in ways it should not. Reality bent until nobody could tell whether the horror was happening outside the screen or inside the viewer's head. That confusion is what made it so powerful. Videodrome was not just visually disgusting, it felt mentally unsafe. It arrived during an era when families were filling homes with cable television, VHS tapes, and late-night channels, and the movie twisted that modern excitement into a warning. The effects were slimy, surreal, and unforgettable, but the true discomfort came from the idea behind them. Maybe the thing entertaining you was also changing you. For adults, it was provocative. For kids, it was pure, forbidden nightmare fuel. RoboCop, 1987. A lot of kids thought they were getting a cool robot hero movie, then the 80s handed them industrial-strength trauma. RoboCop became legendary because it mixed action, satire, sci-fi, and corporate cruelty into something brutally memorable. On the surface, it had everything a child might be drawn to: a shiny armored hero, futuristic weapons, criminals, and comic book energy. But beneath that surface was a movie far more violent, grotesque, and emotionally harsh than many young viewers were ready for. The transformation of Murphy into RoboCop is not just a superhero origin, it is a nightmare of bodily destruction, identity loss, and corporate ownership. The film's most infamous moments hit with shocking force: the extreme gang violence, the toxic waste mutation, and the sight of a human body reduced to something pitiful and horrifying. What made it worse was the tone. RoboCop could be funny one moment and deeply disturbing the next, which made kids lower their guard before the next brutal image arrived. The practical effects gave every wound and mutation a sick physical weight. This was not clean, futuristic violence. It was messy, painful, and mean. RoboCop endured because it is brilliant, but childhood viewers often remembered it for a simpler reason. They came for a robot cop and left with images they could not erase. The Fly, 1986. This was not just a monster movie, it was a slow-motion breakdown of the human body. The Fly disturbed viewers because the horror did not arrive all at once. It crept forward, stage by stage, as Seth Brundle changed from a brilliant scientist into something tragic, diseased, and barely human. David Cronenberg made the transformation feel painfully intimate. The peeling skin, strange hairs, damaged teeth, leaking wounds, and collapsing physical control were not random, gross-out images. They showed a person losing himself piece by piece. That is what made the movie so upsetting for younger viewers who caught it too early. The monster was not hiding in the shadows. The monster was the body itself, betraying its owner in full view. The love story underneath made it even harder to watch because the audience could still feel the person trapped inside the decay. The effects were disgusting, but the emotion gave them weight. This was not clean sci-fi mutation. It was illness, obsession, romance, and fear twisted together. For adults, The Fly was a tragic masterpiece. For kids, it was the terrifying discovery that transformation did not have to be exciting. Sometimes it could be painful, ugly, and impossible to stop. On The Thing, 1982. No 80s sci-fi nightmare made the human body feel less trustworthy than The Thing. John Carpenter's frozen paranoia machine took one simple fear and made it unforgettable. What if the person beside you was no longer a person at all? The Antarctic setting already felt isolated and hopeless, but the real terror came from the creature's transformations. Bodies split, stretched, twisted, opened, and rebuilt themselves into shapes that seemed impossible. A dog kennel became a nightmare chamber, a human chest became a trap, a severed head became something that should not move, but did. For kids who saw it on television, VHS, or through an older sibling's bad decision, The Thing was visual punishment. It did not just show aliens, it showed flesh refusing to obey nature. The practical effects had a wet, rubbery, handmade realism that modern Polish rarely matches, which made every mutation feel physical and wrong. But the movie's deeper scar was psychological. Nobody could be trusted. Every calm face might be hiding something monstrous underneath. That idea lingers longer than the gore. The Thing earned its place at number one because it did not simply frighten childhood viewers. It made them suspicious of bodies, friends, animals, and silence itself. Some of these movies were sold like harmless sci-fi adventures, but they ended up becoming childhood scars people still talk about decades later. The wild part? Modern studios rarely take risks this disturbing anymore. So which movie traumatized you the most growing up? And did we miss one that still lives rent-free in your nightmares? Drop it in the comments, then like, subscribe, and come back for more forgotten cinematic nightmares.